All right, Dennis, welcome back to The Research Says, the series where we take our biggest clinical questions and find the definitive, evidence-based answer. Today, we're tackling one of the most common questions in restorative dentistry, a decision we make dozens of times every single week. When does a tooth actually need a crown instead of just a filling? We all know the conversation with the patient who asks, "Can you just put a bigger filling in there?" And if we're being honest, a lot of the time, our own internal red line for when to make that call can seem a bit fuzzy. It often comes down to more of a gut feeling, but a gut feeling doesn't create consistency. It doesn't give you the rock solid conviction that you need to confidently explain your treatment plan. So today we're going to replace that gut feeling with hard data. We're going to look at what the research says are the clear, objective indicators that a tooth has crossed the line from needing a simple patch to needing a full structural reinforcement. Before we dive into the specific studies, let's quickly touch on the underlying scientific principle here. A filling is designed to fill a hole. It's a patch. A crown, or any form of cuspal coverage, is designed to be a structural brace. Its job is to hold a weakened tooth together and redistribute the occlusal forces that we exert when we chew, which can be hundreds of pounds per square inch. Teeth become structurally weak when things like cracks, wide preparations, or the loss of a marginal ridge undermines the integrity of the cusps, turning them into thin, unsupported walls that are vulnerable to fracture. Our job is to identify the precise point where that structural weakness becomes too great for a simple filling to handle. So let's look at the evidence. What are the clear, research-backed situations where a crown is the superior and more predictable long-term solution? First, let's talk about cracked teeth. We see them all the time. That little crack line running from an old amalgam filling across a marginal ridge. What does the research say that we should do? A study from 2022 in the Journal of Endodontics followed cracked teeth over an 11-year period. They found that placing a crown on those teeth early in the process improved the long-term prognosis by a crazy 98%. But it gets even better. An earlier study, also in the Journal of Endodontics, looked at cracked teeth that had reversible pulpitis, so they had some symptoms, but not yet needing a root canal. And they found that if these teeth were crowned immediately, they had an 80% chance of avoiding root canal therapy altogether. The evidence on this one is pretty clear. When you see a definitive crack, early cuspal coverage with a crown dramatically improves survival and significantly reduces the risk of needing endo down the line. Next up is the big one, the width of the restoration. How wide is too wide for a filling? This is a question that we all kind of grapple with. Well, there was a study in 2021, it was a study in the European Endodontic Journal, and it helped clarify this. They identified that an isthmus width, which is the narrowest part of the prep between the cusps, that is greater than 1/3 of the total intercuspal distance, is one of the greatest single predictors of tooth fracture. 1/3, that's kind of our red line. Once your preparation is going to cross that 1/3 intercuspal width line, the remaining cusps are too thin and unsupported. And then a large filling in that scenario, it actually acts like a wedge, pushing those cusps apart every single bite, and it sets the tooth up for a future failure. The research supports that once you cross that line, cuspal coverage in the form of a crown or an onlay is the recommended treatment to prevent fracture down the road. Now, what about endodontically treated teeth? This is a debate that I really don't think should be a debate anymore. And the research is also quite clear. A study from the Journal of Prosthetic Dentistry looked at the long-term survival of endo-treated teeth. Their findings were kind of jaw-dropping. Posterior teeth that did not receive a crown after a root canal were 6 times more likely to be extracted compared to those that were crowned. 6 times. An endo-treated tooth is, by definition, structurally compromised. It's been hollowed out and has become more brittle. And the research unequivocally tells us that failing to place a crown on these teeth is leaving them incredibly vulnerable to catastrophic failure. And what if a cusp has already fractured? This one's pretty simple. The clinical consensus and countless reviews all are in agreement. A fractured cusp requires cuspal coverage. A crown is the standard of care. This one's not really negotiable from an evidence-based perspective. You have to replace and protect the lost structural component. Now, finally, let's talk about the risk modifiers. These are the patient-specific factors that should push you off the fence when you have a borderline case. A major study in the Journal of Dental Research from 2014 looked at the long-term failure of large composite fillings. They found that 2 factors significantly increased the failure rate: a high caries risk and a higher number of surfaces being restored. On top of that, countless other reviews consistently flag bruxism and heavy occlusal loads as major risk factors that dramatically lower the survival rate of large fillings. So if you're on the fence about any of the situations that we talked about, maybe the crack is subtle or the prep width is right on that 1/3 line, the presence of high caries risk or signs of heavy bruxism should absolutely push you toward recommending a crown. These factors are just like pouring gasoline on a fire. Now that we have the academic research and we see what it tells us, but actually there's another really interesting piece to this puzzle. As we know, the standard of care isn't just about the latest research paper, it's also about what a consensus of our peers would do in a similar situation. There's a fascinating study from the National Dental Practice-based research network, and it helps us understand exactly that. They surveyed over 2,000 dentists on a variety of things related to when they would recommend a crown. There was pretty good consensus on some things, like when asked if endo-treated posterior teeth needed a crown, over 95% of dentists said yes, which aligns perfectly with the research that we just discussed. It was a little more divided on the anterior teeth, but still over half of dentists would do crowns on most anterior teeth that needed endo. But the more interesting part is related to non-endodontically treated teeth. They showed these dentist pictures of 4 different teeth with failing restorations of increasing size, and they asked if they would recommend a crown. For the first picture, picture A, a small failing filling, only about 2% were likely to recommend a crown. That makes perfect sense, but for picture B, which showed what looked like a larger failing DO filling, about 48% of dentists were likely or very likely to recommend a crown. So that scenario is actually a true 50-50 split among dentists. Personally, I would probably lean a little more on the crown side on that one, but it's interesting to see how divided it is. Then they showed picture C, a failing MOD. For that one, about 66% of dentists, or 2/3, were likely or very likely to recommend a crown. And then finally, for picture D, a tooth with a massive failing restoration and fractured cusps, 97% of dentists were likely to recommend a crown. I don't know what on earth the other 3% were planning on doing, but I guess that just goes to show us that you will never get everyone to agree on absolutely anything. So what this survey shows us is that if you have a failing DO filling on the larger side, about half of your peers would recommend a crown instead of another filling. If you have a failing MOD, about 2/3 of your peers would recommend a crown. I think this is incredibly helpful information. It gives us a real-world benchmark and should give you confidence that when you recommend a crown in these situations, you are well within the standard of care and in good company with your fellow dentists. So what's the actionable takeaway from all of this? What is the clinical checklist that you can use in your operatory Monday morning? The research combined with the professional consensus gives us a very clear and simple framework when you're looking at a tooth. You can run down this mental checklist. Does the tooth have a definitive crack? Does the preparation cross the 1/3 intercuspal width line? Has the tooth had endo? Is there a fractured cusp? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then the evidence strongly supports that the tooth needs some form of crown or cuspal coverage for predictable long-term success. If you have a failing restoration, think twice and take a closer look to see if it just needs a new filling, or if a crown would be a better treatment. And if you find yourself on the fence with any of those, then you look at your risk modifiers. Is the patient a heavy bruxer? Do they have a high caries risk? If so, that should firmly and quickly push you toward recommending a crown. If a tooth doesn't meet any of that criteria, then a well-placed conservative filling is likely the perfect treatment. Now, if you appreciate this straightforward, evidence-based approach to answering our biggest clinical questions, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications for the next video in the Research Says series. Let's keep working together to make dentistry fun, fulfilling, and rewarding. Subscribe so you don't miss the next strategy, and I'll see you soon.